Let me tell you about the night a woman held herself together so tightly, for so long, that when she finally broke, she broke in front of the last person anyone would expect. Her name was Nicole. Nicole James. 24 years old. Lagos-born, Jersey City raised by stubbornness. She had braids that took her 6 hours to do herself because she couldn't afford the salon, a smile that could light up a room she was too tired to stand in, and a scholarship to New Jersey City University that her entire village back home believed was the beginning of something miraculous. They weren't wrong. But they also didn't know what it cost her. Every single morning, Nicole woke up at 5:15 in a shared apartment on Tonnelle Avenue, where the radiator knocked like it was angry at the world, and the walls were thin enough to hear her neighbor's television through them. She would make instant oats, the plain kind because the flavored ones were 12 cents more, and she would sit at the small kitchen table with her textbooks open, studying international relations before the sun had even decided to show up to work. Then she would take the PATH train. Then she would smile at strangers. Then she would pour coffee for people who never once looked at her face. Then she would sit through 3-hour lectures on geopolitics, taking notes with a pen that was almost out of ink. Then she would come home, call her mother in Lagos, listen to news about her younger brother Mark's hospital bills that were climbing like a fever that wouldn't break, and then she would say, "Don't worry, Mama. I'm handling it. I'm fine." She was not fine. She was the furthest thing from fine. But Nicole had made a decision the day she boarded that flight out of the airport with $40 in her pocket and a prayer tucked behind her sternum. She decided that falling apart was a luxury she could not afford. Not until that night. Not until the last customer had gone. Not until the cafe chairs were flipped up on the tables and the rain outside was hitting the Journal Square windows like it had a personal grievance. Not until her phone lit up with a message from her mother, making the whole world go quiet in the worst way. That was the night she finally let herself cry. And the only witness, the only one sitting in that empty gold-lit cafe, was a man named Ji-tae. He was not supposed to be there. Men like him were never supposed to be in places like this, quiet, ordinary, smelling of espresso and lemon cleaner. He ran half of Hudson County's shadow economy from a glass office in Newport. His name made grown men lower their voices. He had never in his 35 years of life needed anything from anyone. But that night, as Nicole looked up at him through a blur of tears and whispered the words that would change something permanent inside him. "Please don't stop. Please don't stop talking to me like this, being here. I need this more than you know." Ji-tae felt something crack open behind his ribs that had been sealed shut since he was 9 years old. He had power. He had money. He had fear. But no one, had ever needed him. This is the story of a Nigerian girl chasing a dream in New Jersey, and the unlikely man her realness unmade. Stay with me. You're going to want every single word of this. Hey everyone, drop a comment right now. Where are you watching from today? And tell me honestly, if you were Nicole, exhausted and alone in that cafe on a cold night, and the tears finally came, what would you do? Would you let someone see you break? Drop it below. Now let's get into the full story. The first thing Nicole James noticed about New Jersey was the cold. Not the cold of Harmattan back home, that dry, dusty wind that swept down from the Sahara and left your lips cracked and your mother pressing shea butter into your hands before school. No. This was a different kind of cold entirely. It was a cold that had no patience for you. It came off the Hudson River like a living thing, slid under your coat collar and settled into the space behind your collarbone as if it had always lived there, and you were the intruder. She had arrived in late August 2 years ago now, when the cold was still hiding its time, when New Jersey was still wearing the bruised gold of a late summer that didn't know when to quit. Her scholarship letter from New Jersey City University had been printed out and laminated by her mother, who had then placed it inside the family Bible for safekeeping, as though divine protection might transfer through the pages. Her father had stood at the departure gate at the international airport and cried silently, the way Nigerian fathers cried, face turned slightly away, jaw tight, pretending it was the airport lighting. Nicole had not cried. She was the oldest. She was the one going. She was the one who was supposed to make it matter. 2 years later, she had made a life out of small, stubborn victories. Her apartment on Tonnelle Avenue was shared with 2 other women. Chinyu, a Igbo nurse in her 30s who worked night shifts at Christ Hospital and who communicated primarily through post-it notes on the refrigerator, and Fatima, a Senegalese woman studying nursing at Hudson County Community College who made the most extraordinary thigh boudin on Sunday afternoons and let the smell of it fill every corner of the apartment like a warm, fragrant prayer. The 3 of them had built a careful, kind ecosystem of shared space and mutual respect, the way immigrant women often do. understanding that home is not a place you find in a new country so much as a thing you build, piece by piece, out of familiarity and grace. Nicole's room was small enough that she could touch both walls if she stretched her arms wide, but she had made it hers. A hand-painted Ankara fabric pinned above the window. A photo of her family tacked above her desk. Her mother in a yellow gelly at her cousin's wedding, her father squinting into the sun, her brother Mark grinning that gap-toothed grin that had not changed since he was 6 years old. A small bottle of her mother's perfume she'd brought from Lagos that she never opened, because once it was gone, it was gone. On the desk, textbooks, highlighters color-coded by subject, a notebook dense with handwriting so small it looked like printed type. International relations at NJCU was not easy, and Nicole refused to be anything other than excellent. She sat in the front row. She stayed after class to ask questions. She went to the library on weekends when the apartment was too loud with the sounds of other people's homesickness. She was going to graduate. She was going to find work with a development organization or the African Union or the United Nations. She had a plan with stages and timelines and contingencies. She also had a brother who was sick. Mark was 19. He had been diagnosed with a kidney condition the previous spring, one of those diagnoses that arrives with complicated words and uncomplicated devastation. The doctors in Lagos had been clear. Treatment was possible, but treatment was expensive. Their parents had savings, but savings have floors and they had hit the floor months ago. Nicole sent home a portion of every paycheck. She had recalibrated her budget so many times that the spreadsheet on her laptop had 12 versions, each one tighter than the last. She ate lunch at the university's discounted meal program. She walked when the weather allowed rather than spending on bus fare. She bought her coffee supplies in bulk from a discount store on West Side Avenue. Which was why the irony of working in a cafe was not lost on her. Harmony Brew Cafe sat on a corner near Journal Square, 2 blocks from the PATH station, wedged between a Bangladeshi grocery and a Dominican hair salon. It was small and warm and unpretentious, with mismatched chairs and Edison bulb lighting and a chalkboard menu that Nicole rewrote every morning in her careful, looping handwriting. The owner, a middle-aged Puerto Rican woman named Gloria Reyes, had hired Nicole after a 5-minute conversation and a trial cappuccino, declaring that anyone who made foam like that and smiled while doing it deserved a job. Nicole worked 4 shifts a week. She was punctual to the minute. She remembered regulars' orders. She learned names, learned preferences, learned the quiet art of reading a person's mood from the way they pushed open the door. The grad student who always needed a double shot on Thursdays before his seminar. The elderly Dominican man who came every morning for café con leche and stayed an hour reading the newspaper and needed no conversation, only company. The young mother who arrived at 8 a.m. with a stroller and the particular exhausted relief of someone awake since 4. Nicole gave each of them what they needed. It was a gift she had always had, the ability to see what a person required and offer it without making them feel seen in a way that made them uncomfortable. Her mother called it ojuti, a Yoruba phrase that translated loosely to something like gracious perception. The ability to read the room with your heart. It was a Tuesday in October when Ji-tae first walked through the door. Nicole noticed him the way you notice weather, not because it announces itself loudly but because it changes the quality of the air. He was tall, lean in the way of a man who had always been careful about his body, dressed in a charcoal suit so well tailored it seemed almost foreign inside the cheerful clutter of Harmony Brew. He wore no tie. His dark hair was pushed back from his face with the kind of carelessness that required effort. He stood just inside the doorway for a moment, rain-damp at the shoulders, looking at the menu on the chalkboard with an expression Nicole had learned to recognize over 2 years of watching faces. He looked like someone who had forgotten what it felt like to want something simple. "Welcome in," she said, her Nigerian accent warm and clear across the counter. "Take your time with the menu. It's raining sideways out there, you've earned a slow decision." He blinked as if the friendliness surprised him. "Coffee," he said. "Black. Any particular origin? We have an Ethiopian yirgacheffe that's almost embarrassingly good right now, or a Colombian medium roast if you want something less." She searched for the word, eventful. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the neighborhood of one. Ethiopian. She poured it with care the way she always did and slid it across the counter. He paid without looking at the price, which told her something. He took the cup to the corner table by the rain-streaked window, the table nobody wanted because the draft from the door reached it, and he sat down and he wrapped both hands around the cup, and he looked out at the wet gray street. And he stayed there for 2 hours. He didn't use his phone. He didn't open a laptop. He just sat there, occasionally drinking, occasionally watching the street. Nicole, between orders, found herself glancing over at him. There was something almost architectural about the way he sat, perfectly still, perfectly contained, like a building that had decided to become a person and wasn't entirely sure it had made the right choice. When he finally stood to leave, he buttoned his suit jacket with 2 precise movements and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the handle. "The coffee was good," he said, not looking back. "Come back when the rain is worse," Nicole said. "We make it better on those days." He glanced back then, just briefly, just enough for her to see something flicker in his dark eyes that she could not name. Then the door swung shut behind him, and the bell above it rang once, and he was gone into the gray October evening, and Nicole stood behind the counter with a coffee cloth in her hand, thinking that she had never seen a man look that thoroughly alone in the middle of a crowd. She hoped he would come back. He did. He came back the following Thursday. Same time, early evening, just as the after-work rush was thinning to a trickle and the cafe was settling into its quieter, warmer self. Nicole was restocking the pastry case when the bell above the door rang, and she looked up, and there he was, Ji-tae, again in a dark suit, again rain touched at the shoulders as though the weather had decided to make a habit of him. "Ethiopian again?" she asked before he reached the counter. He stopped. "A beat. You remembered." "I remember everyone's order," she said, reaching for the portafilter. "It's part of the job. But yours was easy. You looked at the menu like it was a difficult contract and then ordered the most straightforward thing on it." He considered this with the seriousness of a man who considered everything. "Is that an observation or a critique?" "An observation," Nicole said cheerfully. "I don't critique people's coffee orders. That would be overstepping." This time the corner of his mouth actually arrived at a smile. Small. Brief. Like a shy animal checking if it was safe to come out. He took the same corner table. But this time, when there was a lull and Gloria had stepped into the back to call her supplier, Nicole brought over a small plate with 2 chin-chin, the crunchy Nigerian fried snacks she sometimes brought from home and set out for regulars, and set it on his table without ceremony. "What is this?" he asked. "Chin-chin. Nigerian snack. Fried dough with a little nutmeg. Try it. If you don't like it, I'll refund you, except it's free, so the economics of that are complicated." He picked one up. Tried it. His expression did the thing expressions do when something is better than expected. A small involuntary softening around the eyes. "It's good," he said, with the slightly stunned delivery of someone unaccustomed to being surprised by small pleasures. "My mother's recipe," Nicole said, and she meant to leave it there, to go back behind the counter and leave the man to his solitude. But he said, "Your mother taught you to cook?" And something about the way he said it, not small talk casual, but genuinely curious, like a man pressing his ear to a wall to hear music he'd forgotten existed, made her stay. "My mother taught me everything worth knowing," Nicole said. "And then I came here and had to learn everything else." She laughed softly. "The gap between those 2 categories is very educational." He looked at her with steady, unhurried eyes. "What do you study?" "International relations. At NJCU." She tilted her head toward the university a few blocks away. "I want to work in development. International health policy, maybe? Or the African Union. There's so much work to be done on the continent." She caught herself, the way she sometimes did when her passion got ahead of her. "Sorry? I tend to monologue about this." "Don't apologize," he said quietly. "Most people only talk about what they have. You talk about what you want to build." The word settled on her like something unexpected. A compliment so precisely aimed it almost felt like a small wound. "And you?" she asked. "What do you do?" Pause. "Careful and deliberate." "Business," he said. "Import and export mostly. Restaurants. Some other interests." "Vague," she said, smiling. "Intentionally," he replied. And somehow that honesty made her trust him more than a full answer would have. His name, she learned that evening, was Ji-tae. "Just Ji-tae is fine," he'd said when she asked, with the dismissiveness of a man shedding a title. Over the weeks that followed, he came to Harmony Brew twice a week, then 3 times. Always the same corner table. Always the Ethiopian. Sometimes he would sit in silence and Nicole would leave him to it, understanding that some people come to a place not for company but for the feeling of company, the warm hum of other humans nearby, the smell of something being made, the proof that the world was still populated and ordinary. But other times, in the quiet intervals between customers, they talked. And Nicole, who had not realized how starved she was for a certain kind of conversation, the kind that asked questions and then actually waited for the answers, found herself looking forward to those intervals more than she was entirely comfortable admitting. She told him about growing up in Lagos, about the chaos and color of it, the way traffic moved like a living argument, The way her mother's street came alive at night with hawkers and generators and the sound of Fela Kuti drifting from a neighbor's window. She told him about her father, a secondary school mathematics teacher who had drilled into all his children the idea that knowledge was the one thing that could not be taxed, confiscated, or taken at a border. She told him about Afrobeats, about how Burna Boy's music had a frequency that found you in your chest even when you heard it through bad phone speakers, about how Ace's voice made her homesick in the specific, bittersweet way that only music can. She told him about the particular loneliness of being a black African woman in New Jersey, not the aggressive kind of loneliness, but the ambient kind, the feeling of constantly translating yourself, of existing in a country that saw your blackness before it saw your Nigeria, and your Nigeria before it saw your Lagos, and your Lagos before it saw you, specifically you, Nicole James, who was afraid of pigeons and cried at cooking shows and could recite the preamble of the African Union Constitutive Act from memory. Ji-tae listened to all of this with the focused attention of a man for whom listening was not passive. He would ask follow-up questions, quiet and precise. He would remember details from previous conversations and reference them weeks later. He did not offer advice or solutions. He did not try to fix anything. He just listened and looked, and occasionally said something so unexpectedly perceptive that Nicole would blink and think, where did that come from? In return he offered fragments. He had grown up in Seoul before coming to the United States at 19. He had no family to speak of. This was said with such complete neutrality that it was somehow more devastating than if he'd said it with sadness. He liked architecture. He had read, in Korean translation, every novel by Chinua Achebe. When Nicole's mouth fell open at that last detail, he looked almost pleased with himself. Things fall apart 3 times, he said. It is a book about what people do when the structures they built their identity on collapse. Nicole studied him. And what do they do? Some of them fall apart, he said. Some of them build something new from the rubble. She thought about that on the PATH train home, the city lights smearing against the rain-dark windows, the car swaying. She thought about it while she heated up the jollof rice Fatima had left in the fridge for her. She thought about it while she called her mother and said, "I'm fine, Mama, everything's fine." She realized, not quite as fine as she said. But she was, for the first time in longer than she could remember, not quite as alone. November arrived in Jersey City the way it always does, without ceremony and without apology. One day the trees along Kennedy Boulevard still held their burnt amber leaves like they were refusing to let go, and then one morning Nicole walked out of her apartment, and every branch was bare and the sky was the particular flat white of a city that has decided winter is no longer a threat but a fact. She added a second layer under her coat. She moved her morning study sessions from the kitchen table to under her blanket, laptop balanced on her knees, Nigerian gospel music playing low through her earbuds because the soft percussion of it made her feel like her mother was in the next room. The news from home had taken on a new weight. Mark's treatment was ongoing, but the latest round of tests had shown that his kidneys were responding slower than the doctors had hoped. Her mother's voice on the phone had acquired a careful quality, a studiedness, as though she was editing herself in real time to protect Nicole from the full weight of it. But Nicole was her mother's daughter. She heard everything that wasn't said. She had recalculated her budget for the 13th time. She had applied for an additional on-campus tutoring position that would give her 8 more hours a week, though those were 8 hours she did not have. She had started skipping the university gym to save the activity fee. She ate more egusi soup made from scratch because the dried ingredients were cheap and lasted, and because making it felt, in some uncountable way, like a prayer for home. At the cafe she was the same Nicole she had always been, warm, precise, present. Gloria noticed nothing, which was exactly what Nicole intended. What Gloria did notice was that Nicole had started requesting the closing shifts, and she'd raised an eyebrow and asked if everything was all right, and Nicole had smiled and said she simply studied better in the mornings, which was not entirely a lie. The closing shifts paid a slightly higher hourly rate. Every dollar mattered. What she had not expected, what she could not have planned for, was that the closing shifts were also when Ji-tae came. He had shifted his visits naturally, without discussion, to the quieter evening hours. He would arrive as the last of the regular crowd thinned, order his coffee, take his table, and stay until Nicole began her closing tasks. Sometimes they talked for the better part of an hour. Sometimes he simply kept her company in companionable silence while she wiped tables and swept and balanced the register, and the radio played low in the background, and outside Journal Square went about its business in the dark. One evening in mid-November she was telling him about her international law seminar, about a debate they'd had regarding post-colonial legal frameworks in sub-Saharan African countries, and she was animated, hands moving, voice lifting, and Ji-tae was leaning forward with his elbows on the table watching her with the concentrated stillness of a man watching something rare. "You should be in policy rooms," he said when she paused. "Not a classroom." "I will be," she said. "One day. First I have to survive the classroom." "Are you surviving it?" The question landed with more accuracy than she expected. She smoothed her apron. "I'm enduring it strategically," she said, which made him make the small sound that had become his version of a laugh. She did not tell him about Mark that night. She told him about her coursework, about a professor she admired, about the research paper she was writing on health policy and economic development in West Africa, which was both academically relevant and personally driven in ways she didn't fully explain. But something must have shown. Because 3 days later, Gloria called her aside before her shift and told her that the cafe's hours were being slightly restructured. Effective immediately, Nicole's shifts would include the higher-rate weekend closings, and also, a small monthly bonus was being added to her pay as a performance recognition. Gloria said it with the brisk efficiency of a woman announcing inventory counts. She moved on before Nicole could respond. Nicole stood behind the counter for a long moment after that, running the numbers in her head, understanding what the difference would mean, what it could cover, what pressure it could relieve, how many fewer hours of middle-of-the-night calculation she might be spared. She did not know for certain. She could not prove it. But she thought about Ji-tae, about the way he had looked at her in those last few evenings, that careful attention, and the casual remark he'd made once that the cafe seemed to undervalue its best staff, said lightly, said almost to himself. She decided not to bring it up. She did not want to make it a thing that required acknowledging. Whatever had happened, whether it was coincidence or something more deliberate, she accepted it the way she had learned to accept good things in hard seasons. Quietly, with gratitude, without pulling at the threads of it. But she made him the best cup of Ethiopian coffee she had ever made the next time he came in. She slid it across the counter and met his eyes and said nothing. He took the cup and said nothing. And in the space between them, something was understood that did not need words. Their conversations in November went deep in the particular way conversations do when the cold outside makes the inside feel more real. Ji-tae talked more than he had before, still in fragments, still carefully, but more. He told her about Korea in winter, about the way Seoul lights up in December, about a restaurant his grandmother had run in Mapogu that smelled of doenjang jjigae and pine, about how he had not been back in years, about how going back felt like visiting a version of himself he no longer recognized. "Do you miss it?" Nicole asked. A long pause. Outside, a siren moved through Journal Square and faded. "I miss the idea of it," he said. "I think I miss who I thought I would be there." Nicole looked at him steadily. "I understand that," she said. "I think immigrant life is partly the ongoing work of mourning the version of yourself that never got to happen." He looked at her with something that was not quite surprise but was close. The look of a person who has just heard a sentence that articulates something they have carried wordlessly for years. "Yes," he said quietly. "Exactly that." November deepened around them, colder and closer, the river gray beyond the waterfront, the path trains running their steady pulse beneath the city streets. Nicole added more layers to her walk home. She called her mother every other night. She made progress on her research paper. She told Mark a long, funny story about a pigeon that had somehow gotten into the Journal Square station and caused a 3-minute delay, and she listened to her brother laugh and thought, hold on, hold on, hold on. She was building something here in this cold city. She could feel it even on the hardest days. Something slow and real and entirely hers. December came. And with December came the particular cruelty of a season that is beautiful for everyone who can afford to enjoy it, and merely cold for everyone who cannot. Jersey City glittered. The waterfront path station was strung with lights that reflected off the Hudson in ribbons of gold. The shops along Newark Avenue played carols and displayed window arrangements that smelled of pine and cinnamon. The university held its end-of-semester events, a multicultural showcase, a food fair in the student center, a holiday concert in the auditorium, and Nicole attended each one wearing her best expression, the one that said, "I am fine, I am present, I am grateful to be here." Inside she was a woman carrying a house on her back. Mark's latest test results had come back and they were not good. Not catastrophic, the doctors were careful with that word, but not good. The kidney damage had progressed slightly. The treatment protocol needed adjustment. The new protocol cost more. Her mother had presented these facts with the calm, systematic delivery of a woman who had spent decades teaching her children that panic was a choice and practicality was a love language. Nicole had hung up the phone and sat on the edge of her bed for 7 minutes. She knew it was 7 because she watched the clock, methodically, as a way of not falling through the floor. Then she opened her laptop and began recalculating. She had already eliminated every non-essential expense she could identify. She had already applied for a second tutoring position, which she got, 2 more mornings a week in the math lab, which overlapped uncomfortably with her own study schedule but which she managed by sleeping 1 less hour per night, which she managed by drinking 1 more cup of coffee per day, which was at least available to her at cost at Harmony Brew. She began looking quietly at the scholarship application cycles for the spring semester. She researched emergency hardship funds through the university's financial aid office. She drafted an email to her International Relations Department chair asking about research assistant positions. She was methodical about it. She made lists. She made lists of her lists. What she could not make a list about was the feeling that was growing in her chest like a slow-rising flood. Not despair exactly, because Nicole was not built for despair, but something heavier than tiredness and lighter than hopelessness. A gray, grinding kind of fear that had no specific shape and therefore no specific solution. At the cafe she was flawless. Gloria had never had a better employee. The regulars loved her. The December tip jar was the fullest it had ever been. At NJCU she was producing her best academic work of the semester, driven by some combination of stubbornness and the knowledge that her scholarship depended on her GPA, which depended on these final papers which had to be excellent, full stop. At home she was careful not to let Chinyu or Fatima see too much. They had their own lives, their own pressures. She was not going to be anyone's burden. She showed it to Ji-tae though. Not in words, she wouldn't have known how to begin that conversation, and some part of her was still guarding the gate of her troubles against anyone she might be tempted to lean on. But Ji-tae was observant in the way only very still people are. He noticed the slight purple beneath her eyes that hadn't been there in October. He noticed the way she sometimes stood behind the counter and looked at nothing for 3 or 4 seconds before snapping back into herself. He noticed that she had stopped bringing Chin from home. He said nothing directly. He was not the kind of man who pushed. But he began arriving a little earlier, which gave them more time to talk before closing. And he started, in the careful oblique way that was entirely his own, having conversations with her that were essentially permission structures, opening doors through which she could walk if she chose to. "My grandmother lost her restaurant once," he said one evening, watching the Journal Square traffic through the rain-blurred window. "She had 6 children. No husband. She had to rebuild from nothing." Nicole looked at him. "What did she do?" "She made a list," he said. "She said, here is what I have. Here is what I need. Here is the gap." Then she addressed the gap one item at a time. He paused. She said the secret was not to look at the whole gap. Only the next item. Nicole was quiet for a long moment. "That's good advice," she said. "It's the only advice that ever actually helped me," he said. She understood that he was giving her something. A framework. A model. She also understood that he knew something was wrong without knowing what, and that this was his way of saying, whatever it is, there is a way through. She found, unexpectedly, that she wanted to tell him. Not everything. But something. The pressure of carrying it alone had been building so long that the idea of even partially setting it down made her eyes do something dangerous. "My brother is ill," she said finally, her voice level, professional almost. "Back home. The treatment it requires resources. I am managing it." She kept her chin up. "I'm always managing." Ji-tae looked at her for a long moment. His face said nothing, which she had come to understand was not absence but containment, the expression of a man who felt a great deal and had learned, over 35 years, to keep it carefully internal. "How old is your brother?" he asked. 19, she said. Something moved behind his eyes. "Brief. Gone quickly." "Tell me about him," Ji-tae said. And she did. She told him about Mark's gap-toothed smile, about his ambition to study engineering, about the way he called her every Sunday and opened every call with a joke, always a bad one, always delivered with complete confidence in its excellence. She told him about the time Mark had taught himself to cook jollof rice from a YouTube tutorial and had produced something that was technically jollof in the same way that a drawing of a car is technically transportation. She told him about his bravery, the quiet bravery of a 19-year-old boy pretending to his family that he was not afraid. By the time she finished, the cafe was empty and the street outside was quiet, and both of them sat with the weight of it, the particular comfortable weight of a real thing that has been spoken aloud. "He sounds like someone worth fighting for," Ji-tae said. "He is," Nicole said. "He is absolutely worth every single thing." She looked out the window at the December street, the Christmas lights blurring in the wet glass, and held the thought of Mark like a coal in her hands. Warm. Real. Worth the heat. She did not know how close to breaking she was. She did not know that breaking was only days away. The night it happened was a Wednesday. The coldest Wednesday in December, in a December that had already been unkind. The temperature had dropped to 19 degrees by 9 o'clock, and the wind off the Hudson made it feel like 10, and Journal Square was the kind of cold, wet, deserted that a street becomes when the weather announces it has won and all the reasonable people have gone inside. Harmony Brew had closed at 9. Nicole had been the only one there for the last hour. Gloria had left at 8 with the implicit trust of someone who had never once had reason to doubt her. Nicole had done the closing tasks with the focused efficiency that was, by this point, entirely automatic. Wiped tables, stacked chairs, swept, balanced the register, counted the tips, portioned out her share into the small envelope she kept in her apron. $22. She noted it in her phone. Every dollar went into the spreadsheet. She had just finished mopping the floor behind the counter and was wringing out the mop when her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. A message from her mother. In Yoruba, which her mother only used when the thing she needed to say was too heavy for the translation. She read it once. She read it again. Then she set the mop down against the counter with a careful, deliberate movement, the way you put something down when your body is doing something that your brain has not yet processed. Mark had been admitted to the hospital. An acute episode. The doctors were managing it, her mother said. They are managing it, Nicole, please do not panic. But the cost of the emergency treatment had depleted the last of what they had set aside. The family was managing. They were always managing. But if Nicole could send anything at all, in the next few weeks it would help. Her mother ended the message with 3 prayer emojis and a heart. Nicole stood in the middle of the empty cafe, the mopped floor gleaming under the Edison bulbs, her phone in her hand, and she did the calculation. She did it in her head the way she always did because by now she had memorized every number. Her current balance. Her next paycheck date. What she could send. What that would leave her. Whether she could cover rent on what remained. The tutoring money which hadn't come through yet. The tip envelope in her apron. $22. The math did not work. She had run out of ways to make the math work. She stood there with this knowledge, alone in the bright, empty, cinnamon-smelling cafe, and the thing that she had been holding back for months, for years if she was honest, since the day she'd boarded that plane in Lagos with $40 and a prayer and told herself she would be enough, she would be enough, she would be more than enough. That thing rose up through her chest and arrived at her eyes without any further warning. She did not make a sound at first. Just stood there, tears running down her face in the particular silent way of a person who has cried alone enough times to have learned not to accompany it with noise. Her shoulders shook once. Then again. She was so deep in it that she didn't hear the door. She had forgotten, because she had forgotten everything in the last 60 seconds except the math that didn't work and her brother in a hospital bed in Lagos, that she had left the front door unlocked. That Ji-tae had, in the weeks of their evening conversations, developed the habit of stopping by on his walk between his Newport office and his car 15 minutes, sometimes 20 for the coffee and the company. That she had told him once that the door was always open until she flipped the sign. He walked in carrying cold air and the smell of winter and stopped completely when he saw her. She heard him then, the small sound of the door, the hush of his shoes on the clean floor. She turned away quickly, raising one hand to her face in the instinctive, futile movement of someone who knows they have already been seen. Nicole. His voice was quiet. Not alarmed. Not demanding. Just present. I'm sorry, she said, her voice catching. Give me one moment, Don't apologize, he said, the same words he had said to her weeks ago in an entirely different context. He set his coat on the nearest chair and walked toward the counter and went around it, which no one did. It was her space, but somehow it was right, and he stood a few feet from her, close enough to be there, far enough to not crowd her, and he asked with that quiet directness that was entirely his own, "What happened?" She meant to give him the edited version. The managed version. She meant to say it's a family situation, I'll be fine, I just needed a moment. She had been saying versions of that sentence for 2 years. Instead she told him everything. About Mark. About the hospital. About the message. About the math that had finally stopped working no matter how many times she recalculated it. About the spreadsheet with 12 versions. About the tips in her apron envelope. About the scholarship and the tutoring and the extra shifts and the meal program and the instant oats and the bottle of her mother's perfume she never opened and why she never opened it. She told him all of it, standing in the middle of her own mopped floor with tears on her face and a mop in one hand and $22 in her apron, and she did not perform composure, not once, not for a single sentence. And Ji-tae stood there and listened with his whole body, not moving, not interrupting, not looking away. He listened the way only people who have known a specific kind of loneliness can listen. Like every word was water and they had been thirsty for a very long time. When she was done there was silence. Just the sound of the December wind against the cafe windows, and the distant rumble of a PATH train beneath the city, and her own unsteady breathing. "I'm sorry," she said again. I didn't mean to put all of that on you." "Don't," he said. She shook her head. He had started to speak, she couldn't remember afterward exactly what he had said, something about her brother, something about her strength, something in that low, careful voice that had no performance in it, and it was the realness of it, the complete absence of anything scripted, that made her say what she said next. She looked up at him through the blur of tears, this tall, contained, lonely man who had appeared in her cafe on a rainy October evening and stayed, who had listened and remembered and seen her, not the barista or the scholarship student or the daughter or the one who was managing. "Please don't stop," she whispered. He went very still. "Please don't stop talking to me like this." Her voice cracked and she let it. "Being here. I need this more than you know." The cafe was completely silent. Han Ji-tae, who ran the Obsidian Vale Syndicate across Hudson County, who had not been afraid of anything or anyone in 26 years, who had built his entire life on the principle that needing nothing was the only sustainable position, felt something break open in his chest like a door blown off its hinges by a wind he hadn't known was coming. He had been needed before. For decisions. For resources. For protection. For the power he represented. But no one, not once, not ever, had looked at him through honest tears and said, "You, specifically you talking to me being here, I need this." Not the money. Not the power. Not what he could do. He reached out and placed his hand, briefly, gently, on the counter beside hers. A small gesture. An enormous gesture. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. The days after that Wednesday carried a different quality of light. Nicole noticed it first at 5:15 the following morning, sitting at her kitchen table with her textbooks open and her oats growing cold beside her. The winter sun was not yet up, it rarely was at that hour in December, but the apartment felt less sealed against the world than it usually did. Something had shifted in the overnight hours. Something that felt, tentatively and carefully, like relief. She had walked home from the cafe that night in the cold, her breath visible in the air, and she had not cried any more tears. She had simply walked, past the closed storefronts of Journal Square, past the man selling roasted chestnuts outside the PATH station, past the mural of Jersey City's history painted on the side of a parking garage, and she had felt, step by step, like a person who had set down something extraordinarily heavy and was still feeling the ghost weight of it in her arms, but whose arms were now, undeniably, free. She had called her mother from her bed at midnight. Her mother had cried. Nicole had said, "Mama, we're going to be okay." And this time, for the first time in months, she had believed it as she said it. She did not know exactly what Ji-tae would do, or if he would do anything. She had not asked him for anything specific. She had simply broken open. Allowed herself to be witnessed. And that act of vulnerability, which she had resisted for so long with the full force of her considerable stubbornness, had felt not like weakness but like something closer to courage. Her professor Dr. Okpara, who taught her West African political economy seminar, had said once during a lecture, "The greatest act of resistance in a world that profits from your silence is to insist on being known." Nicole had written that down and never quite understood it until now. At the cafe that afternoon she was quieter than usual. Not sad but interior, the way a person is after a significant weather event, when the storm has passed and you're walking through the aftermath taking inventory. Gloria set a cup of tea in front of her during the slow late morning hour and said, without preamble, "You look like someone who slept hard," which was her way of saying you look better, kid. Nicole smiled and said, "I did." Ji-tae did not come that day. He didn't come the next day either. For a brief and uncomfortable 48 hours, Nicole sat with the possibility that she had revealed too much, that the weight of her truth had been more than the container of their friendship could hold, that she had miscalculated something important. She kept this anxiety private the way she kept most things. She submitted her final international law paper. She tutored 2 undergraduates in the math lab who were struggling with statistics and found, as she always did, that helping someone else understand something clarified her own thinking. She video-called Mark from her phone and sat cross-legged on her bed while he told her in elaborate detail about the nurses at the hospital who kept bringing him extra biscuits because he had, apparently, charmed every single one of them. "You are impossible," she told him. "I am extraordinary," he corrected, gap-toothed and grinning even from a hospital bed, and she laughed until she had to put the phone down for a moment because the sight of him, so completely, irrepressibly himself, filled her up in a way that was almost painful. Ji-tae came back on Saturday evening. He walked in without the suit jacket. The first time she had seen him without it, he wore a dark sweater instead, and he looked, she thought, like a man who had made a decision he was still settling into. He sat at his usual table and she brought his coffee without being asked, and when the cafe had emptied she pulled out a stool from behind the counter and sat across from him and looked at him directly. "Are you all right?" she asked. Because she was still Nicole. Because she still noticed first. He looked at her for a moment. "I've been thinking," he said. About how long it has been since I did anything that was not about strategy." She considered this. And I want to be honest with you about something." He turned his coffee cup once in his hands, a small, uncharacteristic gesture that told her the thing he was about to say cost him something. "I arranged the shift changes with Gloria. In October. When I could see you were under pressure." Silence. Nicole sat with this. She had suspected. She had decided not to pull at the thread. But now the thread was out and she looked at it and she looked at him. "You did that without asking me," she said. "Yes. That's," she searched for the right word. "Not angry, not quite. Something more complicated. That's the kind of thing that could feel like being managed." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm telling you now. Because what you said to me on Wednesday, I don't want there to be anything between us that isn't clear." The phrase between us settled in the air of the cafe and neither of them examined it too closely. "Why did you do it?" she asked. A long pause. Outside, a group of people walked by laughing, their voices briefly bright against the cold glass. "Because I could," he said. "And because," another pause. Longer. "Because watching someone work that hard and ask nothing of anyone and carry all of it alone felt like watching something remarkable be slowly crushed by its own weight. And I couldn't." He stopped. "I don't usually interfere in things. It's not my way." "But you interfered in mine," she said. "Yes." "Why mine specifically?" He looked at her steadily with those dark, direct eyes that had never once looked away in any of their conversations. "Because you're the first person in a very long time who talked to me like I was a person," he said. "Not a resource. Not a name. Not something to be feared or used or avoided. Just a person sitting at a table with a cup of coffee." Pause. "I am not accustomed to being treated that way." Nicole sat with this for a long moment. She thought about every interaction they had ever had, every cup of coffee she'd slid across the counter, every piece of chin-chin, every conversation they'd had in the empty cafe while December knocked against the windows, and she saw it from his side for the first time with any real clarity. He was as lonely as she was. In an entirely different geography of loneliness, surrounded by subordinates and power and carefully maintained distance. But lonely in the exact same fundamental way. Missing being known. Missing being needed for the simple, unstrategic reason of just being a person worth being around. "Ji-tae," she said. "Yes." The shift changes were overstepping. "Don't do things for me without telling me first. I need to be part of the decisions about my own life. That matters to me more than the help." He nodded. "Understood." "But," she let the word breathe. "Thank you. For caring enough to do something. Even the wrong way." She met his eyes. "And what I said on Wednesday, I meant it. This friendship, whatever it is, whatever it's supposed to be, it's been one of the best things about this year. In a year that has had very few best things." He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something in his face that she had never seen there before. An unguardedness, clean and complete, like a window that has been opened after a very long winter. "For me too," he said quietly. "More than you know." And in the warm light of the empty cafe, with the December cold kept at bay by old radiators and thick walls, something between them settled into a new and more honest shape. Not less complicated, but realer. And realness, Nicole had decided, was always worth the complication. 2 days before Christmas, Nicole saw the other side of Ji-tae's world for the first time. She hadn't been looking for it. She had been, in fact, in an unusually good mood. Her final grades had been posted the night before, and she had received an A- in international law and a straight A in West African political economy, and Dr. Akbra had attached a note to her grade portal saying, "Outstanding final paper. This work belongs in a journal." She had read that sentence 5 times and then called her mother and read it to her too, and her mother had made a sound that Nicole associated with deep, cellular satisfaction. The semester was over. She had 2 weeks of holiday break. She had picked up extra shifts at the cafe. The math, while not fully resolved, had eased slightly. A medical charity organization her mother's church had connected with was contributing to Mark's treatment costs. which did not solve everything but move the wall a few feet further from her face. She was, on that particular Tuesday afternoon, carrying 4 bags of groceries from the West Side Avenue Discount Market toward the Journal Square Path station, already planning the pot of egusi soup she was going to make that evening, already anticipating the specific comfort of standing at a stove and cooking something her mother had taught her to cook. She turned a corner and nearly walked into a wall of black wool. 2 men, both large, both wearing identical expressions of carefully calibrated neutrality, stood on the sidewalk outside a restaurant she recognized, one of Ji-tae's legitimate fronts, a Korean-Japanese fusion place called Sable that had recently opened and that she had walked past a dozen times. The men were not doing anything visible. They were simply standing there, but in the particular way of people who are standing there professionally, and they shifted slightly when she turned the corner, a movement that was both instinctive and trained. Through the restaurant's glass front she could see Ji-tae. He was at a back table with 3 other men, all in suits, all with the quality of stillness that reminded her of the way Ji-tae had looked the very first time he'd come into the cafe, except that in context now, surrounded by others with the same quality, it read differently. He was speaking. She could not hear him. He was not looking at her, he hadn't seen her yet. But his posture was entirely different from the posture he had at Harmony Brew. Straighter, more contained, the posture of a man who was not simply present but was, in fact, running something. One of the men outside noticed her standing there and made a small, deliberate movement that was not threatening but was clearly communicative. "This is not a space for you to linger." Nicole stepped back. She shifted her grocery bags and kept walking. Her heart was moving a little faster than usual, which she noted with the observational quality she brought to most of her own reactions. She had known on some level. He had told her himself on their first evening. Business, import and export, restaurants, some other interests. The vagueness had been intentional and she had accepted it as intentional and left it there, in the comfortable shadow of the unasked. But seeing it, the men, the configuration, the quality of authority in the room behind that glass, made the shadow take on a more specific shape. She thought about it on the PATH train home. She thought about it while she made her egusi soup, the red palm oil blooming in the pot, the blended pepper mixture making the kitchen smell like Legos. She thought about Mark and her scholarship and the bottle of perfume she never opened, and the kind of life she was building here, molecule by molecule, in the cold city by the river. She thought about what trust meant, what it required, what it risked. She was stirring the pot when her phone buzzed. "Ji-tae, I think you may have walked past Sable today. I wanted to check that you were well." She stared at the message for a moment. She typed back, "I'm well. Good egusi soup happening here. Are you well?" Pause. Then, "Yes. May I ask, do you have questions?" She appreciated that. The directness of it. The refusal to pretend she hadn't seen what she'd seen. She typed, "A few. But not over text. Come to the cafe Thursday?" His response was immediate. "Yes." She set the phone down and tasted the soup and added a little more crayfish and thought about what she was actually asking when she said she had questions. She was not, she realized, asking whether the things she suspected were true. She was asking whether the man she knew, the man who remembered her brother's name, who listened without agenda, who had felt undone by being told he was simply needed, whether that man was consistent with whatever she had seen through that restaurant window. She believed that he was. She needed to understand why she believed that. Thursday was 2 days away. The day before Thursday, something happened that she hadn't expected. She was leaving the university library at dusk, her bag heavy with books she was reading over the break, when she passed one of the international student notice boards in the hallway and a flyer caught her eye. It was for an emergency medical fund administered through the International Student Services Office. A fund she had not known existed, had not been told about when she'd first inquired about hardship resources. The fund was for international students with dependent family members facing medical crises. She stood in the hallway with her heavy bag and read the flyer 3 times. Then she took a photo of it. Then she found the campus financial aid office, still open for another 20 minutes, and she walked in. The advisor she spoke to confirmed the fund was active and had available resources this cycle. She told Nicole the application was straightforward. She said the maximum disbursement for this cycle was substantial, more than Nicole had dared to include in any version of her spreadsheet as a realistic possibility. Nicole walked out of the financial aid office into the December cold and stood on the campus path for a moment, breathing the sharp winter air, looking up at the Jersey City sky in the particular way of a person who has just been reminded that the universe is neither entirely cruel nor entirely kind, but occasionally, specifically, precise. She did not know if this fund had always been there and she had simply not found it, or if someone had made a call, left a word, directed someone's attention to a need. She could not know. She chose for the moment not to know. She chose to feel the specific weight of the relief and let it be enough. She went home. She called Mark. He had been moved from the acute ward to a regular room, he told her, and had already befriended every patient on the floor. Of course you have, Nicole said, and her laugh was so real, so uncomplicated, that it startled even her. Thursday arrived. Nicole had thought carefully about how she wanted to begin the conversation. She had given it the same structured consideration she gave her academic papers. What was the actual question? What did she want to understand? What would constitute a useful answer? She had a legal pad in her bag with 3 bullet points on it that she had decided she would not actually show him, but that had helped her organize her thinking. She was, underneath the structure, afraid. Not of him. She did not think she was afraid of him in any physical or direct sense. She was afraid of the specific disappointment that comes from finding out that someone you trust is a significantly different person than you thought. She had come to rely on Ji-tae in a way that was, for Nicole James who relied on no one, genuinely new territory. The idea of having to revise that reliance was its own kind of vertigo. She opened the cafe for the afternoon shift, made coffee for the regulars, restocked the pastry case, rewrote a section of the chalkboard menu where the rain had smeared the chalk. She was efficient, cheerful in the way she was always cheerful at work. Genuinely, not performatively, because she genuinely liked this work, genuinely liked these people in this warm small room. Ji-tae arrived at 4:30. The cafe had 3 other customers, so they did not speak immediately. He sat at his table. She brought his coffee. He looked at her with the look that asked how she was without forming the words, and she gave him the look that said later. When the last customer left at 5, she untied her apron and folded it over the counter and walked to his table and sat down across from him. Full across from him, not at an angle, not partially. Directly. She had decided that this conversation deserved directness. What I saw outside Sable, she said. Those men. What you do, the business. I need to understand what it is. He had known this was coming. She could tell by the slight adjustment in his posture, the way he put his coffee cup down with exactly deliberate care. I run an organization, he said. The legitimate businesses, the restaurants, the import-export company, the cafes, are real in their mind. But they exist within a larger structure. Pause. The Obsidian Veil is what some people call it. It is a network with influence across Hudson County and parts of New York. I head it. What kind of network? She said. He looked at her steadily. The kind that operates in spaces where official structures don't reach. Commercial interest, property, mediation, territory in some cases. She absorbed this. She was careful not to fill in gaps with drama. She was analytical by training and by temperament, and she knew that the gap between implies criminal activity and is a monster was a large one that many assumptions crossed too quickly. Have you hurt people? She asked. I have made decisions that affected people's lives in ways they did not choose, he said. Whether that constitutes harm depends on where you're standing. I'm standing right here, she said. Where I'm standing, does it constitute harm? A long silence. I protect my people, he said. I have never been the source of gratuitous harm. But I operate outside the law. And the world I operate in has consequences, yes. She looked at her hands on the table. Then at him. Why do you keep coming here? She asked. To a small cafe in Journal Square. With me. Specifically. Because this is the only place I go where I am not Han Ji-tae, the head of anything, he said. I am just Ji-tae. The person. Who drinks Ethiopian coffee and eats chin-chin and argues with a Nigerian grad student about post-colonial theory. Something moved in his face. Fragile, honest. I didn't plan on that mattering to me as much as it does. Nicole was quiet for a long moment. She thought about her father, who had taught her that knowledge was the one thing that could not be confiscated at a border. She thought about Mark, bravely enduring something he hadn't chosen. She thought about herself, who she was, what she was building, what she would not compromise. I can't be part of anything illegal, she said. That is completely clear. My visa, my scholarship, my entire future is built on staying exactly on the right side of that line. I won't cross it, not for anything. I know, he said. I would never ask you to. And I won't pretend I didn't hear what you just told me, she said. I won't make it comfortable for you by looking past it. I'm not asking you to. Then what are you asking? She said. What is this? Between us. What are you expecting? He looked at her for a long time. The Edison bulbs hummed overhead. Journal Square moved past the windows, the December dark settling over the city like a coat. Nothing, he said. I expect nothing from you. I don't have a design here, Nicole. Her name in his mouth, deliberately used, precisely met. A rare halting. I found something here that I have not found in 35 years, and I don't know what to call it, and I don't know what its form is supposed to take. I only know that I don't want to lose it. She looked at him. She looked at the man who had listened to her cry about her brother. The man who had remembered her grandmother's restaurant story and used it to give her a framework for survival. The man who had sat in the cold corner table of this small cafe twice, 3 times a week for months, not for anything she could give him, but simply because she had treated him like a human being and it had been, for him, enough to come back for. She thought about complexity. She had spent 2 years studying international relations, a field built entirely on the recognition that human beings and their structures are irreducibly complex, that good and harm are not distributed neatly into separate containers, that the world is not arranged to make moral clarity easy. She thought about what she knew of Ji-tae specifically. The man at this table. Not the organization, not the structure, not the power, the man. I see you, she said finally. I see all of what you just told me. I'm not ignoring it and I'm not making it small. She met his eyes. But I also see who you are when you're here. And those 2 things are both true at the same time, and I'm not willing to only see one of them. She exhaled slowly. I'm not going anywhere either. But I need you to understand, I see you clearly. And you need to see me clearly too, which means you need to understand that who I am, and what I'm building and what I will not compromise, is not negotiable. Not ever. He looked at her with something that was, she realized, the expression of a man being seen so clearly it was almost difficult to bear. I understand, he said. Good, she said. She stood, picked up her apron, walked back behind the counter. She reached for the coffee grinder. Then she looked back at him over her shoulder. Do you want another cup? She asked. And the smallest, most unguarded smile she had ever seen on Han Ji-tae's face arrived and stayed. Yes, he said. Please. January came in cold and clean. Jersey City in January had a stripped-down quality that Nicole had learned, over 2 winters, to appreciate rather than merely endure. The trees were bare and the sky was wide and the Hudson River ran steel gray and restless, and there was something honest about it. No color to distract from the actual shape of things. The city showed you its bones, and if you had built anything worth having you could see it clearly now. Nicole could see what she had built. The emergency medical fund application had been approved in the 3rd week of December. The disbursement had gone through in 2 installments, the second arriving just before the new year, and together they had not solved everything but had pushed the crisis far enough back from the edge that her mother had called her on New Year's Eve and for the first time in a year, had said, I am not worried tonight, with the uncomplicated delivery of a woman who meant it. Nicole had sat on the fire escape of her Tonnelle Avenue apartment, wrapped in her coat and a borrowed blanket, the city spread below her in its winter electric light, the path trains moving in the distance like rivers of light beneath the streets, and she had let herself feel the relief fully. Not the managed version. The full version. The kind that begins in your stomach and moves upward through your chest and arrives at your eyes as something you can't entirely hold. She let it go. She let herself have it. Mark had been discharged from the hospital 2 days before Christmas. He had called her from his phone, weak signal, his voice slightly thinner than usual but entirely himself, and said, Sister, I have been practicing the jollof rice. I will show you when you come home. It is significantly better than before. It can only be better than before, she said. You have no faith, he said. I have tremendous faith, she said. Just not in your jollof. He had laughed and she had laughed, and across the ocean their laughter had overlapped for a moment in the telephone static, and it was, she thought, one of the most beautiful sounds she had ever heard. At NJCU the spring semester began with a momentum she had not felt since her first days, the momentum of someone who has survived a genuinely difficult thing and arrived on the other side with their integrity intact and their direction clear. She enrolled in an advanced seminar on African development policy. She formally applied for the research assistant position in her department and was selected. She began outlining her senior thesis, which she had decided would address the intersection of diaspora economics and health access in West African nations, a subject, she noted privately, that she now understood with a kind of first-hand specificity that no syllabus had given her. Dr. Akbara had read the thesis outline and scheduled a meeting. He had told her, with the careful enthusiasm of an academic who had trained himself not to overpraise, that the angle was precisely the kind of work that crosses from the academic into the genuinely necessary. She had walked out of his office and stood in the January wind on the campus path and thought, yes, this is why I came here. At the cafe she was as she always was, and also, slowly, differently. The difference was internal, barely visible from the outside. A slight ease in her shoulders, a slightly longer pause before she answered when someone asked how she was, as though she was actually checking rather than retrieving the automatic response. Gloria had noticed. "You're lighter," she said one morning, not looking up from her inventory. "I think I am," Nicole said. Ji-tae still came. Twice a week, reliably, the corner table, the Ethiopian coffee. The patterns of their conversation had not changed in form but had changed in depth. The way a path that has been walked many times becomes not just familiar but truly known, the way your feet find it even in the dark. She told him about her thesis. He asked questions that were, as always, more perceptive than expected, drawing connections she hadn't made yet between diaspora remittance economics and healthcare infrastructure funding patterns. She looked at him across the table. "You've thought about development economics," she said. "I've thought about how money moves," he said, "and what happens to communities when it moves wrong. It's not so different." She considered this. "You know," she said, "that brain of yours is genuinely wasted on whatever you do with it." The corner of the mouth response arrived. "Perhaps," he said. "But then I would not have had reason to sit at this table." They were quiet together for a moment, the comfortable quiet of people who have learned each other's silences as well as their words. Outside, January moved through Journal Square, coats and scarves and breath visible in the air, the path station exhaling warmth into the cold, the corner bodega lit bright against the gray afternoon. "I've been thinking about Korea," Ji-tae said. Nicole looked at him. "In what way?" "Going back," he said. "Not permanently. But, there are things I have left unfinished. People I have avoided." Pause. "I think I have been avoiding them because they belong to a version of myself I was not sure I wanted to revisit." "And now?" she asked. "Now I think," he said carefully, "that avoiding a version of yourself is only possible for so long before it begins to cost you. In ways you don't fully account for." He looked at his coffee. "You've shown me that. The way you carry your home with you, not as a burden but as a source. The way your identity is not something you manage around but something you lead with." He looked up. "I have not done that. With my own history. I think I need to start." Nicole looked at him with the warm, direct regard that was entirely her own, the Ojuti her mother had named, the gracious perception that saw not just what was present but what was possible. "That's growth," she said simply. "Real growth. The kind that actually costs something." "Yes," he said. "It's worth it," she said. "I can tell you from experience, carrying your history openly is heavy. But it's lighter than dragging it behind you in secret." He nodded slowly. "When you go to Korea," she said, "will you come back?" Pause. The most deliberate pause she had ever heard from him. "Yes," he said. Quiet. "Certain. There are things here that I am not willing to leave permanently." She did not ask him to clarify whether she was one of those things. She didn't need to. She had learned that some truths are communicated most accurately through the things that surround them rather than the thing itself. Like how you know a fire is present not just from the flame but from the warmth that has already reached your hands. She reached across the table and put her hand briefly on his. The same small, enormous gesture he had made to her on that cold Wednesday night in December. Then she withdrew it and picked up her coffee cup. "I think you should go," she said. "And I think when you come back you'll be slightly more like the person you were always supposed to be." "You're very confident about that," he said. "I am very often right," she said, and the full Nicole smile arrived. The bright one, the real one, not the one that hid exhaustion but the one that had no reason to hide anything at all. Anhan Ji-tae looked at her, this woman who had arrived in New Jersey with $40 and a prayer and turned it into a life, who had broken open in an empty cafe and not treated it as weakness, who had told him "I see you clearly" and meant it from both directions. And he felt the particular sensation of someone who has spent their entire life in the dark discovering, slowly by small degrees, that warmth was something they were allowed to move toward. He had built an empire on the understanding that needing nothing was protection. What Nicole had shown him, without ever intending to, was that the things worth having were precisely the ones that required you to need. Months from now, Nicole James would stand in her university auditorium in her graduation gown, her family watching from Lagos over a video call, her research assistant work cited in a department publication, her thesis advisor calling her work important, and she would know that she had built this. Piece by piece, layer by layer, instant oat at a time. And somewhere in Journal Square, a tall man in a dark suit would stop outside a small cafe with warm lights in the window, and push open the door, and the bell above it would ring once, and Nicole would look up from behind the counter. "Welcome back," she would say. and he would be